Welcome to the Alan Moore presentation, everybody, and we'll see in a minute whether everything's going to work.
I find how many these days someone does Alan Moore title just because of the fact that Alan Moore is Alan Moore.
Yeah, well, he is pretty fascinating.
He's a strange individual.
Yeah, oh yeah, we're going to touch on that a little bit. Okay, since you, yes, thank you. Thank you, kindly. And if you wouldn't mind hitting at least the front lights, if that's possible.
Cross-elimination.
Or, you know, they're probably going to be all, if they need to all come up. Is that okay, everybody? Or,
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
Even that's fine, yeah. Okay. All right, so thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. I realize it's supper time, so I wasn't expecting this would be one of the packed crowds, because naturally, except for folks with cheesies and stuff, people want to relax. So I'm Minister Faust, and you saw me with other fine local writers selling books outside. And Alan Moore was one of the great, and is one of the great influences on my writing, and I've always been impressed by his work. So right now we're going to take a little tour. Now it's called Alan Moore versus Alan Moore, and some of the write-up that some of you may have seen said, you know, which Alan Moore series is the greatest of all. And I will tell you in advance, I am mostly sticking to superheroes, so I won't be addressing From Hell, and there's several other, you know, big numbers, and Moore writes a lot. So I'm not going to be talking about every Alan Moore that there's ever been, but we will be looking at Swamp Thing, Miracle Man, V for Vendetta, Top 10 Watchmen, and Alan Moore Man himself, the ultimate superhero. Okay, so let's have a look, and hopefully when we have some video, we'll have audio as well. Assuming it will all work. Okay, so Alan Moore, you know, I mean, the man is a fascinating figure, English writer. One could argue the most influential English language comic book writer since the Silver Age, since the time of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And I don't know if anybody else has had a broader impact. He's also really quite bizarre, and I can't tell how much of what he does and says is an act designed just to kind of freak people out, or if it's what he really believes and feels. I don't know, and more power to him. Let's have a little look at some of why Swamp Thing is such, his work in Swamp Thing is so amazing. So Swamp Thing began in The House of Secrets. Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson at least did the series, and I'm assuming that they did the, yeah, it's Wrightson's signature right there on the left. You know, it was a pretty dopey character, just, you know, it was the 1970s, lots of horror comics. I guess that was in. I can still remember the times and the little models you would get with the guillotine and the pendulum, and people would read horror comics. Now it seems a little strange that kids could go off by horror comics, Tomb of Dracula and all that. And the character really wasn't all that interesting. A man who became a monster because of a swamp secret formula, then he falls into the swamp after burning, and he comes back with swamp secret powers. Kind of a typical dopey comic. Alan Moore in the 1980s he's already gotten some fame in England, and DC hires him to do some stuff. And so long before we heard the term reimagining that we would get with Battlestar Galactica, Alan Moore was a serial reimagining. Now, other people had done this kind of task before, Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum reimagining the X-Men, but you know, there hadn't been a lot of this kind of stuff. It's big time with Alan Moore. So he takes a kind of a silly, low-powered swamp monster creature and makes it a much more sophisticated story. Drops soon after they drop the Comics Court Authority imprint, or seal of approval. Above the title would read sophisticated suspense, trying to let parents know maybe this isn't for your kids, and also let adults know you're going to enjoy this more. And what you get from Alan Moore right off the top is language that is a lot more rich and interesting, you know, poetical. You get dialogue that is a lot more human and real and interesting, and characters that have psychological depth. He takes this dopey swamp monster character and takes the premise seriously. Ecology, connection with all life on Earth, the fact that plants, what's it plants? Plants, of course, provide a great number of psychedelics in the world. So Swamp Thing's body can produce actual hallucinogenic, they look like yams, basically. And one issue is all about some various drug-oriented people taking these yams that the Swamp Thing's body has exuded, and depending on the type of person, they get a totally different trip. So somebody whose wife is dying from cancer gets a beautiful odyssey with her so that they can have a moment of peace and joy together. Somebody who's a real asshole has a terrifying nightmarish vision. So, fascinating stuff. Revisionist takes on vampires and werewolves. Now that doesn't seem so strange. But back in the 1980s, even, I mean, the 70s horror age had kind of died down. Alan Moore starts to do this with vampires and werewolves. He has a feminist take on werewolves. He does stuff with vampires where what new can you possibly do with vampires, especially nowadays? He sets his underwater. A town, you know, it's kind of like Katrina, New Orleans, and the whole town is flooded out, and vampires underwater are protected from the sun's rays. So they can be active all the time. So this is kind of, you're reading, you're used to the same old, and Alan Moore comes in and reinvigorates it all, and it's fascinating. Religious themes. As I call it, eco-paganism. So, as it turns out, Swamp Thing, the former scientist Alec Holland, he's not just a man who had a terrible scientific accident, fell in the swamp and became a monster. As it turned out, Alec Holland died that night and didn't know it because he was dead. But this thing, this essence, this spirit of the swamp, called in European tradition, the Green Man, and when I was a kid, that was my first introduction to that concept, inhabits Alec Holland's DNA and mixes it with the swamp water and makes a creature that thinks it used to be Alec Holland. And in Alan Moore's story, there have always been swamp things. These avatars, these avengers of the green world in humanoid form. And in Moore's story, after a certain career of being this ecological avatar, a swamp thing doesn't just die and drop off or fall into the, the compost pile. Instead, he joins, or she joins, the Parliament of Trees, as tall as redwoods. These are almost like Kirby-style, ancient immortals, and they have their trees, so they think and talk very slowly, and Swamp Thing is very alienated from them. But he seeks them out because, as we're about to see, Alan Moore also looks at Christian eschatology, or end-of-the-world doomsday prophecies, because at this time DC is running the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Alan Moore being the kind of guy who, being as smart as he is and being as interesting he is, he's got to be competitive too. And he's got to say, well, if DC is doing the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is the biggest thing DC could ever possibly do, I'm simply going to outdo them. So in the middle of the crisis, he decides to tell his own doomsday story. It's this multi-issue arc in Swamp Thing that's all going to culminate in issue number 50, which is essentially the ultimate battle of good and evil for the entire universe and all of the multiverse. And so the crisis is actually just a small subset of that. So this was the issue number 50. And for me, this stuff blew me away. I mean, most of us who are genre fans, we knew that our authority figures didn't think much of any genre fiction, and least of all comics. They thought this was for illiterate people. And here I was reading this stuff and being exposed to these complex, historical, sociological, religious ideas like the Green Man and these others. And in this story, we get a fascinating thing. Alan Moore does, as his classic work of reimagining in here, he takes DC's, as he did with Swamp Thing already, they're D-list characters. They're dumbest, dopiest characters like Zatanna. Some of you may know who Zatanna is. She's dressed up like a magician's assistant, with fishnet stockings and a top hat and the whole bit. And he actually makes that an interesting character. In fact, he takes all of their D-list 1970s magic-oriented characters who were so bad that almost nobody can remember them, and they get pulled into this arc. Because one character that Moore has introduced is a guy named John Constantine. Now this doesn't surprise me. We know there's a movie, and we know that there was a series that has lasted for years in comics. But originally, he was a guy who looked like Sting. And he was drawn to look exactly like Sting, and he had an overcoat and the whole bit. It's less obvious here, but in some of the other pictures, he's a dead ringer for Sting. He's a brand new character, and unlike all these other kind of squeaky clean magic characters in DC, he is a guy who's got a bad past. People keep referring to something that happened that he was responsible for, so they don't want to work with him. And he tells them, look, his ultimate magic power is that he's the best con man in the world. So he draws in all these other people to help him fight the war of Armageddon. And as you can see, some of them don't survive it. This is Moore's reimagining involves destructive editing. Some of these characters, they're going to achieve their first dignified, interesting story for adults, and that will be their last story too. So, again, really silly-looking characters like Dr. Fate, who up until that point, everybody had mostly forgotten about, and as a result of Moore's handling, would go on to have their own limited series and some longer-term series. I was 17, I wanted to be a comic book artist, I drew so inspired by this, I drew years later, this came out when I was 16 or 15, and I drew Dr. Fate. A peer took one look at him and said, "Oh, Captain Condom Head." This is the kind of dopey-looking, silly characters that they had, and yet in Moore's hands, working with these excellent artists, these characters became fascinating. And here you see this ultimate force on the right side, this force of evil, the battle of ultimate good and evil, that Dr. Fate attempts to fight. And this thing has a question, and that question is, what is the purpose of evil? Most of us have read a lot of genre fiction and a lot of comics. We've never heard a question like that. What's the purpose of evil? So we have, there we go. So several creatures attempt to defeat this ultimate force. And all of them basically go in fighting or are sucked in. And all of them fail to answer the question, what is the purpose of evil, to this evil thing's satisfaction. Swamp Thing is the only one who walks in willingly and actually doesn't have an answer and has the humility to say, I don't know. And then starts to talk about, our concepts of evil or darkness and blackness. These are already things that I'm evaluating because of their racialized meanings and equations when I was that age. And then he's looking and saying, wait a second, the soil is black. And he's a creature of the swamps. And so for him, the soil is not an evil thing, it's the source of all terrestrial life. So he's allowed to leave because anyway, as you can see, it's fascinating. And as what we also discover is this giant thing they've been walking into is one finger of a whole vast evil body, and obviously it doesn't take much to figure out what the bright glowing hand is. Now this might seem trite to you to get it received like that, but if you read this as part of a long arc, it's quite remarkable. And I mean, it's one of the only comics that I've ever encountered, and I don't know Neil Gaiman's work, that has wanted to investigate religious concepts and themes with some kind of adult sophistication and dignity. Now, where do you go after you've written a story about the end of the world? This is why Heroes failed in the second season. It's very difficult to top that. Well, one of the best things to do is leave the world. So Moore decided then to take his character, a character who was an earth-bound swamp creature, and actually take him through space and multiple worlds. One of the first things that Moore did with Swamp Thing was to kill Swamp Thing. In one of his stories, people assassinate Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing has to regrow himself from a seed so that he can develop a new body. It takes him weeks to figure out how to do it. In fact, he requires his friend to water him, and he worries that the water droplets at the wrong time of day may damage his very tiny little body. So once he learns how to regenerate himself, he can do it more quickly. And in this story, he is conspiracy. He can't regenerate on Earth, so he has to fling himself out of the cosmos. And so we get a space epic inside of this swamp creature story. And this is the mind of Alan Moore, that we can get this incredibly rich soil of the imagination. V for Vendetta, another classic. Predates Swamp Thing. Now, right now it seems hard to imagine that V for Vendetta could be an obscure comic or an obscure character. But beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Alan Moore was reacting to Thatcherism and to Reaganism. And he wanted to write a comic in the far-flung future of 1997 about a fascist takeover of England. And his story is more sophisticated, certainly, and much more subtle than the movie, in which the fascists simply flat out look like fascists. They're fascists who know they're fascists and want to make everybody think that they're bad and they're villains. The comic shows that when fascists arrive, they'll look like the people you're already voting for. And maybe you already did. So let's have a look at some of what Moore has to say. Bring this up. Oops, sorry.
Anarchy is...
Now, the reason we're seeing this is is because the core political idea that Alan Moore wanted to bring across in V for Vendetta is, he calls it anarchy. It's easier if we call it anarchism to indicate we're not talking about people smashing windows and urinating on the streets. He's talking about a political philosophy literally meaning no leaderism, in which there must be direct democracy. Libertarians typically have a similar view. The difference is what they view about profit and who should profit from industry. So let's have a look at what Alan Moore has to say about this to understand why V for Vendetta.
And always has been a romance. It is clearly the best way and the only morally sensible way to run the world. That everybody should be the master of their own destiny. Everybody should be their own leader. This is something that I still believe. I think that even a cursory look around the world at the moment, particularly at the moment, would reveal that it is about 0.00001% of the world's population that causes 99.99999% of the world's problems. And that tiny percentage, it's not the Jewish backing conspiracy. It's not the asylum seekers. It's not the secret homosexual conspiracy running Hollywood. It's not even the Scientologists. It is leaders. That what we need is an administration, at most. We don't need people to boss us about.
So that's Alan Moore's political philosophy boiled down to, a minute and a half or so. And so obviously, we can see that he doesn't simply name capitalism as an enemy, but archism, the structure of hierarchy in which leaders dictate to other people what can happen. And that would include our system of representative democracy, where people hand over their control to other people. And as Moore puts it, the real poles, we're all raised in the view that the poles of politics are left and right, communists and fascists ultimately. Moore says, no, the poles of politics are, one, you surrender all your authority to other people, and the other one is you accept full responsibility for your life, and that everybody in your community does the same. And that means that you are supposed to work with other people. So it's a fascinating thing. You don't need a leader, is his point of view. So that's what V for Vendetta is actually about. Now we'll see some ironies when we get through a couple of other things. Miracle Man, we see some of the same concerns as V, the enemies are fascists. In Miracle Man, there are fascists who are enemies. This is another work of reimagination. But the story has another thing to say about the yearning for power and what happens if you have ultimate power. And before Watchmen, this is where Moore starts to examine how would the presence of superpowered individuals actually deform the world. And instead of simply examining what are super freaks going to do with heat vision or whatever, he imagines, well, how do we feel about an invasive national security or police state? Most people resent even being pulled over if they are speeding. So how do we feel if we're not doing things wrong and other people have the kind of powers, whether they're legal powers or superpowers, that gives them the ability to look through our walls, to know in advance what we're thinking, maybe to know before we know what we're thinking because they can see the future. In other words, it's logical that we would have enormous resentment of and fear of the kind of people who could outthink us and outstrip us in every possible way. So Miracle Man, another reimagining of a dopey character from an earlier decade in England called Marvel Man, then redone as Miracle Man in the US because of the existence of Marvel Comics. And reimagining in such a way that all the old stuff is taken seriously and that there would be a cult that would form around this. I mean, how many of these characters, right, who are supposed to be defenders of the American way or the British way, were really quite consistent with Nazi imagery of the ultimate person. So,
Steve Rogers.
Exactly, that's one of the best examples is Captain America himself would have been Hitler's idea of the perfect man. So a lot of the times, what makes Moore's work so great is that he does deconstruct, takes apart the way we have been made to think about these things to show us our own thinking back to us. And Miracle Man, despite being here, actually literally a deity for some of these neo-Nazis, Miracle Man doesn't see things quite the same way. And one of the values, I think, of Moore's work is that when he presents us with violence, the violence does what the comic writer Steve Gerber, the guy who created Howard the Duck, says violence should do. It should sicken us. He doesn't show us violence so that we'll be entertained. I mean, if I go see a martial arts movie, I walk out of the theater wanting to fight a bunch of people because it just looks so damn fun. I mean, it's like if you go to see West Side Story, you want to dance. Well, now I want to fight. And it doesn't, you don't want to inflict pain, you just want to fight because it looks fun. And Gerber and Moore say, no, let's show that violence is horrible. And there is something so despicable about having so much power, you can simply execute a person by putting your finger through his body as if it were jello, that you immediately start to fear this character who is at the center, even though he's killing a man who is presumably has terrible views. And then you remember, wow, even in comics, supporting the death penalty because you don't like some of these views, that's a pretty terrible thing. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about Miracle Man later on. Top 10, this is post-Watchmen. Top 10 is a series about a world in a multiverse in which every single person is a superhero. So it starts off with a funny, silly premise, and other people had explored it before. It's in, for instance, martial law, which predated Top 10 by, I think, a decade and a half, and it's in some other independent comics from the 1980s. And like martial law, police are the central characters. But Moore, unlike martial law, which is very, very grim humor, Moore manages to tell a really fascinating police story that has excellent characterization, explores many themes that he has already been addressing, in particular queer characters who are presented with actually fascinating, interesting characters who aren't simply victims to be pitied, but they're just three-dimensional characters who are interesting, as well as a world that shows his imagination so magnificently that every page is bursting with things that make you say, wow. It's a story for adults that makes you feel, in the best possible way, like a kid again. That you're seeing that their detective sergeant has a head of a dog. And that at a certain point in an issue, we see that in the changing room, he's getting out of his exoskeleton, and he is an actual real dog. He's a real dog with human-level intelligence. That our character on the left-hand side, Toy Box, is a detective, and when she goes to a crime scene, she takes out her toy box, and it contains weird cobbled-together looking toys of the type that you may have seen in Toy Story, the first one, where they're freakish assemblies. And they are her forensic team. They simply crawl across the yard of the crime scene and collect evidence. And how rare is it for us to open a comic, see a movie, watch a television series, where we have the kind of experience that we had the very first time we saw, for those of us who can remember seeing Star Wars in the movie theater, or Star Trek the original series, or even The Matrix for that matter, something that made us say, wow, with just that unencumbered, totally nakedly honest sense of delight in the new. And that's what Top 10 is. More examples of what the city of Neapolis looks like. And, very interesting stories about actually investigating crimes and office politics and so forth, discrimination. Watchmen. Watchmen, certainly is, as many of you know, probably all of you know, Time magazine named it one of the top 100 works of, I don't know if they said English language literature, I think they said top 100 books since 1923. And, for mainstream corporate paper, magazine, to look at a comic that seriously, that's a good sign that it has really made a lot of people re-examine things. What are some of the things that Watchmen did so well? I should point out the origins of Watchmen for those of you who maybe not Alan Moore-holics as I am. Watchmen didn't start off as what it became, an original set of characters that Alan Moore was supposed to own outright, which DC still owns, alas. In 1985, DC acquired the old Charlton characters, and he had in mind a story. Actually, I wrote it here as the Götterdämmerung. That's incorrect. It was supposed to be called Who Killed the Peacemaker? And so you can see some of our characters. Blue Beetle, He was one of those tech characters whose gadgets, he didn't have superpowers, but he could fight crime with his gadgets. Captain Atom, who had powers of, you know, ultimate destructive force. Nightshade, sultry, female, hand-to-hand combatant, and the Question, a mysterious detective type figure. Those of you know Watchmen, it's pretty easy to see, of course, Night Owl, Dr. Manhattan, the Silk Spectre, and Rorschach. We also had Thunderbolt, the brilliant man, who in fact is the world's smartest man, which gave him the ability to use all of his brain power. And the Peacemaker, so we have Ozymandias, and we have, thank you, the comedian. So this led to, so DC bought these characters and asked Alan Moore, can you do something with these characters? We just got, and you know, Alan Moore, using his habit, his wonderful ability for what I call destructive editing, came up with a story that would have resulted in killing off a whole bunch of these characters, right? Hence the title, They Killed the Peacemaker. Now DC understandably said, well, we just bought them. So what are you doing? So anyway, and then Alan Moore realized, well, actually, if I do versions of these characters, then I can do anything I want, and it's also going to be going with Dave Gibbons. So they concocted a truly elaborate story that changed the game of comics. And the only thing in contemporary terms that did as much in superhero comics was Darknet, which had started just a year before, but they overlapped. Darknet starts in '84, Watchmen starts in October 1985, which in fact the very first issue says in Rorschach's journal that it's October 1985. And I think the movie makes it 1986. So here you can see our Watchmen characters that we're familiar with. On the right-hand side, it was one of the... by the way, for those of you who've seen the movie, the characters are not called The Watchmen, and the story is not called The Watchmen. The book is called Watchmen, and that's an insult. It's from a Roman senator who was concerned about the growing power of the emperor, or perhaps even before he was officially an emperor, and who said, it was Juvenal who said, who watches the Watchmen? In other words, when you think somebody's there to protect you, who's protecting you from your protectors? Because anybody who's got power over you is a threat to you. So in the comic, we get graffiti. We never see the whole graffiti, but it says, who watches the Watchmen? It's one of the story's many motifs. And so in the movie, when somebody says, it's the Watchmen, you know, or I'm thinking of reviving the Watchmen. No, that's not from the comic, and it's important to distinguish that because Moore is making a point about power that partly the film at least loses. One of the characters I think you find quite fascinating is Mr. A, who was, the Question of Mr. A are two of the sources for Rorschach. Now, everybody in the room and many people around the world know who Spider-Man is, and many other great characters, the Hulk and Doctor Strange, Steve Ditko characters. Okay? Steve Ditko, unlike Stan Lee, didn't like the spotlight, went to one convention ever in the early 1960s and left and never went back. There's only apparently a few known photographs of him and one voice recording. Steve Ditko, for those of you who are familiar with Ayn Rand and the objectivists, what people who don't care for their philosophy call the Randroids, Steve Ditko was a big enthusiast of Ayn Rand, and so that's where we get the fountainhead now, Atlas Shrugged. So a super capitalist philosophy based on the idea that greed is good and that you don't owe anybody anything, and self-sacrifice is foolish, it's destructive in fact for society. And Ayn Rand, when she was younger, was completely enthralled with a serial killer who killed and butchered a young girl that he kidnapped. So, you know, who your heroes are may say something about the ultimate breach of your philosophy. This is the Hickman case, if you want to look it up. And Steve Ditko was a big fan of Ayn Rand. And he did, after he left Marvel, or got out of Marvel and went back in, he did these bizarre comics you'll see where he's attacking the United Nations and liberals and all kinds of other, it's really, really bizarre stuff. You think, this guy did Spider-Man? Anyway, so, and you know, Mr. A would, you know, throw a card, you know, at somebody, and the card would turn, I believe it was half black and half white, and would turn all black if the person was bad, and all white if the person was innocent, which would mean that he wouldn't have to kill you. So, Alan Moore's politics are, shall we say, not consistent with Steve Ditko's politics. So Alan Moore wanted to say something about this kind of character, and he gave us Rorschach. And Rorschach, of course, is, unlike Mr. A, who has no origin story, Rorschach, those of you who know Watchmen, like all the characters in Watchmen, gets a full issue origin story. He is a victim of society in a terrible way. A victim of an abusive home, a mother who was a criminal. He's physically abused at least, and perhaps more. He sees nothing but horror. And is it a psychotic break? We don't know. But we do know that he actually fixates upon Rorschach lots at a certain point in his life. And he witnesses the real life, actual historical case of the rape of a woman in New York. He doesn't witness it. He hears about this rape where neighbors in soaring apartment buildings could look out their windows and see what was happening in their alleyway, and that nobody called the police. And so, in the story of Watchmen, there's a dress. I don't think this is in the film. There's a dress which uses Dr. Manhattan's, the ultimate and Dr. Manhattan and his powers, spin-off technology, and it makes Rorschach lots. And when this woman, and Rorschach doesn't know why she hasn't picked up her dress, when she doesn't pick up her dress, it's already been paid for, he takes it home, he doesn't know what to do with it, and when he finds out about this rape murder, he makes a mask out of it because he concludes that he doesn't want to have a human face. If being a human is to be connected with the kind of people who would let a crime like this happen. So it's a truly disturbing story that we get in Watchmen about social responsibility and what it all means, because Alan Moore hates Rorschach's politics, but he gives us a portrait of Rorschach that can make us feel profoundly compassionate for him. And to me, that's one of the most important things that fiction can do, and that Alan Moore has done, is that fiction should get us to understand why it is that the people that we hate and we can't stand, whether they're the person who works in the cubicle next to ours, or the person who's running a country somewhere else, gets us to understand that that human, even if that person might be a sociopath, for instance, that human could have been us. And that person, that view that we've got that they're nothing but evil, isn't the whole story. Alan Moore actually does a whole, running out of time here, does a whole Mr. A chorus as a song, but for time constraints, I won't, but he performs it nicely. So Watchmen changes the game with characters like that, giving a psychological, pathological depth in characterization. His heroes, we've already seen at that point heroes who aren't squeaky clean, but he goes quite a bit further than that. He gives us characters who are profoundly troubled, and he asks the very serious question, what the hell would make somebody put on a circus outfit and run through the streets and punch people in the jaw? That's really bizarre. And Alan Moore is one of the first writers, maybe the first, really to take that question seriously. And one of the things that he concludes by looking at it as if it were our world is, well, many people would be there because it would be a sexual kink. It would be something that would turn them on. And that in other cases, it's because they are the kind of people who like exerting power over other people. And that by wearing a costume, at least they can hide who they really are. Like, for instance, if you decided right now to, why would you wear a costume? If you decided to rob a bank, wear a really, really, really noticeable red hat. And maybe a red jacket. Because they'll all remember the hat and the jacket, and they won't remember your face. So maybe that's one reason why, in Moore's work. But he's also addressing major social issues, particularly, and I would have to say that one of the things I thought that the Zack Snyder film actually did well was the fear of nuclear war. Those of you in the room who are in my generation and older, remember, that wasn't just an abstract concept. We grew up and lived most of our formative years, if not our whole life, with people belief that we might actually be incinerated. Many of us may have gone through blackouts happen at night sometimes, and you've got the lights go out, and you may have wondered, is this it? As the first one goes off in the upper atmosphere to knock out electrical power, right? So this is something that we live with. So this is something that's in the book, the fear of doomsday. The national security state, what does it mean for people to have that much power over you? Sexual identity, one of the very first comics. I think actually the first comic I can remember that had queer characters and who were handled with dignity. And not as paragons of virtue, but as real people with real people problems and real people good qualities as well. Sexual assault, something that we see in comics and genre stuff, but that isn't, we're not told it's assault. But of course it's assault. And that's one of the benefits here is we see early on one character in the 1940s, the young comedian assaulting Silk Spectre 1. And we see this is a presentation of life that is in no way meant to be titillating, but is meant to show us what kind of people want to exert power over other people, and does it stop when they're supposedly fighting, when they're finished fighting crime for the day. And that heroism is quite probably simply the extension of the will of a hyperpowered sociopathic egomaniac. Visual storytelling innovation, a couple of things that Watchmen did that I don't think had ever been done before, working in collaboration with Dave Gibbons. Obliqueness and pacing. What I mean is, we'd never seen a comic book cover like this before. This is considered, would have been considered to be, and still really would be considered to be a sales killer. Like, what is that supposed to be? You can discern that it's blood, happy face. The title goes down the side so the comic's stacked. You can't even see which comic. There was a lot of pushback against these things, and they said, we want to show people we're doing something quite different. And unlike every other comic, superhero comic, that pretty much ever been done, where you have to have a battle scene on the cover, and then an opening splash page or something like that with the hero in full costume, or something, some variation thereof, or within 2 or 3 pages. These comics showed us, this is the very first page of Watchmen #1, you get, the cover is the first panel. And this is something that runs through all of the issues, and it very often returns to that for the final panel. So you get the symmetry of these issues, and then there's 12 issues, and then of these 12 issues, 6 are plot, and 6 are origin stories, and the sequence is outer, and then inner, and then outer. And so what we get is the symmetry of the series, like the Rorschach mask, and this is replicated. They hadn't figured out all this when they started, but as they were going, they decided, okay, we've already done this, what else could we do? Nobody done this, ever. The script for a typical comic is like 25 pages, maybe. The script for Watchmen was over 100 typed pages for Watchmen #1, just one issue. There's over a page of typing just to describe, I think, the first panel. So the level of detail and thought that went into this is astounding. One of the things that they did so beautifully was, we had already had 9-panel pages in comics before, but we got something that I haven't seen anybody else comment on this, but I call it the XO page. So if you look at the page on the right, I know you can't see it from your distance, but no, I'm sorry, let's have a look at the page. This is not a 9-panel page. I want to put it on the next page you've got. This is better. On this page, what you'll see is that you have a city scene that you recognize at the top. This is New York. And then panel #4 is a comic within a comic. Again, something that had never been done to my knowledge. A comic within a comic. Then you go back to New York City. Then you go into the comic. New York, comic, New York. So this isn't the perfect XO page. You have to have panel #2, but many other pages in Watchmen didn't. What makes it so magnificent and elegant is that the conversation in one panel is commenting ironically on the action in the next panel or the panel before it. So you're getting a constant back and forth commentary of 2 stories discussing each other. So a newspaper salesman is talking to a kid and he says, it's like all our old nightmares come back to haunt us, you know, red invasions, masked men. They're talking about current affairs. The comic that the kid is reading is called Tales of the Black Freighter, because in a world with real-life superheroes, people don't, and they present them, people don't want to read escapist literature about superheroes. They hate them. So they read pirate comics, and soldier comics, and romance comics. So Tales of the Black Freighter is a story about a man who is an ordinary sailor. His ship is attacked by the worst pirates in the world, the pirates of the Black Freighter. He's the only survivor. He has to do every grotesque, awful thing just to survive, like, for instance, with rope together the bodies of his dead shipmates so that he can make a raft to get back to his home, so that he can warn everybody in his home that the bad guys are coming. So you read all this, and it's fascinating, it's exciting, it's weird, it's bizarre, and then you realize, I'm just curious, how many of you have read, watched, or seen the movie? Okay, so a few. So this is major spoilers. I'm just telling you right now, we're giving this away. That's what we're here for, okay? So this plot, ultimately, of the supervillain will be revealed at the end of the story, which involves, more than I can go into right now, but involves genetic engineering and teleportation, is a plot to terrify the citizens of the world into believing a falsehood, that humanity is about to be attacked by some massive alien intelligence. And therefore, humanity has to stop gearing up for nuclear war, which is happening in the comic. put aside national differences and unite. The person who's behind this plot is not a supervillain that we thought who was just trying to kill people for the hell of it, but somebody who believed that if you killed enough people in New York City with something like this, that you could terrify the world into peace and unity. And that villain is one of the old characters, Ozymandias, that the other heroes worked with. And here's where you get this portrait of what Moore is talking about so much. As he achieves his ultimate victory of a world free from the threat of nuclear war, in which he saved humanity, he doesn't say, we're safe, or it's over, or it's all right. This man who has dedicated his life to becoming the new Alexander the Great, in his own description, he says, I did it. This is the ultimate monument to his own genius and his own power.
And the Gordian knot thing is in the background.
That's right, exactly. The famous story of the young Alexander who encountered the unsolvable problem of the world, the Gordian knot. And the young Alexander doesn't try to untie it, he cuts it and dazzles all of the wise elders who never realized that that was another solution. So his solution here is, how do you save, at that point, 4.5 billion people? Kill 10 million. Now, for those of us who lived in an era in which some countries saved their economies in the last little decade by plunging into illegal war after illegal war, we see many people make these equations, and that's how powerful people in every society stay in power. And for Moore, who, as you saw in the video clip, is against leaders, this is an example of what he thinks of leaders. The people who govern in your name are people who exercise power, view themselves as heroes, and do terrible things. We're just about out of time. I will say the following. I wanted to show you this. You haven't seen Watchmen. You haven't read it, so this parody is less relevant. Alan Moore was horrified because after he created this magnum opus, this work of genius, discovered that a lot of people simply thought that what made Watchmen great was that it was unpleasant and it featured people with psychopathology. And so we saw in the 1980s a lot of comics coming out that were about Wolverine-style characters who just killed people and did awful things, and these were the so-called dark comics. And they had none of the intelligence, the compassion, the complexity, the social analysis. They were just bad comics about bad people doing bad things. And Moore was devastated that this was his unintended legacy. So, at any rate, he goes on to do some other things, including trying to make comics fun again with series like 1963, which kind of were an attempt to create that Silver Age comic sensibility, and some other comics. But as we close, we'll just look at Alan Moore.
Sorry, we get to 6:15.
Oh, good, thank you. Okay, I'm glad. Okay, I thought, because I couldn't read the schedule, so I was.
Yeah, it confused me too.
Okay, thank you. So, Alan Moore, good, we'll get to see a clip. So Alan Moore, whose age is this shot, is a fascinating character. Fascinating for his political analysis. He's a man who doesn't have a lot of formal education. I don't think he ever went to university. And he's actually written more comics than most comic book writers have.
He's like a drug dealer in high school.
I think that's correct, that's right. And he's very odd in terms of what he says and how he says it. And of course, as an anarchist or as a libertarian, whichever choice you choose, he will take stances that you would regard as inappropriate or use language you might not like. And sometimes it's going to be shocking. So he also, this is his, using the word that he says you must use, he also created a series of porno comics, or pornographic comics. That's, okay, Alan. He appeared in The Simpsons in a very fun episode. I couldn't find a clip for you to see that wasn't overdubbed in, I think, in Czech. That's for some strange reason. In politics, we can see some of the impact of Alan Moore in that we have V for Vendetta, which has popularized the Guy Fawkes mask. And Guy Fawkes, who became, attempting to blow up the British Parliament centuries ago, Guy Fawkes was a symbol for many people of anti-authoritarianism. But Guy Fawkes was, he was a Catholic living in an anti-Catholic regime, and he may have wanted to install a Catholic dictatorship. So he may not be the best symbol of liberty. But then we have, Warner Brothers, a big corporation, the type that Moore despises, who owns his properties against his will. He has his name taken. There's no Alan Moore name on the Watchmen movie. He didn't even earn any money because he wouldn't let them use his name. I think he should have taken the money. And you can, as a writer, insist that they use a different name.
He didn't want any association with it.
Yeah, I would say take the money and do something, of value with it. But at any rate, yeah, he didn't want that. And then you have characters who, in real life, are reminiscent, as this poster shows us, of some of the characters in his own work, like as in V, somebody who challenges authority directly and is made to pay, depending on your point of view, or is in fact a villain, depending on other points of view. But one of the great ironies, of course, in an age of irony, which makes Moore the man also a complex character in this unfolding drama, is that people aren't making their own Guy Fawkes masks. You've all seen pictures of the Occupy movement in various cities, and they have Guy Fawkes masks. They're not making those masks. Warner Brothers licensed that mask for production. So people who are, sincerely attempting, in their perspective, to challenge modern industrial capitalism, are actually paying Warner Brothers to presumably pay virtually slave wages to the sweatshop workers in China who actually make the masks. So it's one of these grand ironies that I'm sure Moore wouldn't approve of, but in some ways it's not surprising that has happened. We can see some of the masks right there. It's also ironic in the movie by the Wachowski brothers, which is really quite a step down from the comic, that in the movie, a bunch of people have these masks at the end of the movie. Somehow Lee has nailed them using an actual company, which would mean that he'd be traceable and he had the masks manufactured. None of that stuff makes any sense. And that they all look like the same person, even though Moore urges people to be individuals. So this is another example of, no matter what you do with your art or anything else, people can completely misunderstand what you're doing, or they can exploit it. Here's Moore's statement on politics. And I should, do I have that? Oh yes, I'll just show you that first. So Moore authored this comic you see on the left, Brought to Light, which is the true life story of decades of CIA international crimes. This is all stuff that's on the public record. It's in legal documents. These are not imaginings of people who wear tinfoil hats. This is stuff that is part of the historical record. Let's have a look what Moore says about writing that comic and a conclusion that he's arrived at that I don't quite understand.
In the mid-1980s, I was asked by an American legal institution known as the Trickster Institute to compile a comic book which would detail the murky history of the CIA from the end of the Second World War to the present day, covering things such as the heroin smuggling during the Vietnam War, cocaine smuggling during the War of Central America, the Kennedy assassination, and other highlights. What I learned during the frankly horrifying research that I had to slog through to accomplish this was that, yes, there is a conspiracy. In fact, there are a number of conspiracies that are all tripping each other up. And all of those conspiracies are run by paranoid fantasists and ham-fisted clowns. If you are on a list targeted by the CIA, you really have nothing to worry about. If, however, you have name similar to somebody on a list targeted by the CIA, then you are dead. The main thing that I learned about conspiracy theory is that conspiracy theorists actually believe in a conspiracy because that is more comforting. The truth of the world is that it is chaotic. The truth is that it is not the Jewish banking conspiracy, or the grey aliens, or the Gulf restoration and the dimensions that are in control. The truth is far more frightening. Nobody is in control. The world is wilderness.
So, an interesting perspective. It is all in light of the research that he actually documents in Brought to Light. He gives many examples of the Central Intelligence Agency, like other intelligence agencies, obviously, of various regimes, successfully executing the people that they intended to. So I'm not really sure why he's backed off of the things that he himself knows so well, but maybe he was being a little bit sarcastic there. Alan Moore argues that magic is real. This came as a bit of a shock to me. Not that I believe that magic is real, but that he was arguing this. It is something that more explores religiously through characters such as Swamp Thing and Dr. Manhattan, those of you who know Watchmen, the idea of the thermodynamic miracle, a scientific reality that Moore uses to inspire wonder and beauty, our sense of beauty in the way that the universe works, in a non-theological way. Here we'll close with this, which is more talking about what he means by magic. And I'd say that he actually contradicts himself in this, but that may be part of why Alan Moore Man is his greatest creation, that we don't really know when he says something, if he really means it or not. He may be a long performance. Anyway, this is about me.
By magic, I mean basically what everybody means by magic. I mean a rabbit out of a hat. I mean something emerging demonstrably from nothing. So to a certain degree, in that I would include our physical universe emerging from a single point in a quantum vacuum. I would include any human thought or idea or work of art which demonstrably starts out nowhere, starts out in the silence of our minds. First there is no idea, then there is a flickering of an idea, then there is a fully realised idea, and then finally we have a physical artifact which we can hold in our hands. We have a book, we have a painting. This to me is a magical act. Any act of creation is a magical act, which is probably why I tend to express most of my magical thinking in terms of creative acts. If I can turn it into a piece of writing, or a set of images, or a performance, so that other people can share the information concerning that realm, then to me that is part of what a magician's job is.
So that's Alan Moore, and there's many more series beyond these that you can read by him. Of course, I haven't just ruined Watchmen for you. If you haven't read it, although I would say that even if you know the ending, you read it anyway, because it's a magnificent work, in the same way that you can reread any book that you've already read and love it. It's so well told, and it has so many things to say beyond simply the revelation of its shocking ending, that you'll be blown away. So thanks for attending today. If you want to get any of my books, I've still got a few before I leave today, and I'll be here all day tomorrow. And please check out my panel, which is kind of like a game show tomorrow, called Why Battlestar Galactica is Better Than All Star Trek Combined. So thank you.
You read that, I think it was in Denver, something that Alan Moore did with like a trial?
No.
The trial thing that he did, that was very interesting in terms of how he concluded, the conclusions he reaches, because it starts off as a simple murder trial and just turns into tracing the history of this both throughout the timeline that what's written and happens essentially.
Interesting. No,
Stuff that is written and what eventually happens and follows it, passing out to these two different characters, and then it ends up culminating in completely redefining this in another light where this one character, one of these characters in his teams got managed to get his hands on this, and he's done. And because it had stolen to various situations, he eventually came into his possession. He read his future, which was pretty dismal, and he rewrote it. And yet, through what he was doing, the world became a darker place. He ties it into how superhero comics became very dark. And that it was all essentially one person, essentially, he makes stuff, and then he wants to make cooler stuff from the fight and stuff like that, and just very narcissistic in that sense.
Well, no, I didn't hear about that.
I came across it at the library a few years back. It was very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for the tech, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad everything worked out.
Oh yeah, well, there would have been no show if you, I wouldn't remember all that stuff, so I need the pictures. Since there is a video record, nobody's come back to turn it off, so maybe you want to contact going to turn it off so that the file doesn't overload the memory there, assuming I can.
Yeah, I guess your best bet would be going to PureSpec.org.
Oh, okay, great.
Or talking to one of the organizers.
Thanks.
The ones who actually have titles on their name badges.
Yes. All right, well, I'm just going to turn it off until the next